Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, a graduate school professor, a former seminary president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome. You'd be hard-pressed these days to hear a church sermon or to read a Christian book that does not come across or does not include a quote by C.S. Lewis. Without a doubt, he is one of the most influential Christian thinkers in modern history, and his influence is far-reaching, really beyond the realm of Christianity. And so we thought on a podcast that is dedicated to church and culture, we would be remiss not to talk about a man who so prolifically has bridged secular culture and the Christian mind in such an engaging way. So hopefully this conversation will both pay homage to Lewis, but at the same time provide encouragement towards ways in which we might also follow in some of his footsteps. Now, Jim, you, I know, have a special affection for C.S. Lewis, and I think I've heard you say before that you've considered him to be somewhat of a mentor to you. And so can you maybe start off the podcast by telling us a bit about how you first came upon him and what it was about him or maybe his writing that most captured your interest or first captured your interest?
You're absolutely right. I'm an unashamed fan of Lewis in every way, and have studied his life, and it's been enhanced by my own studies at Oxford and being where he taught and lived, and picked up a lot of stuff on Lewis while I was there from people who knew him. It was really interesting to talk with him. And one of my more recent books, Christianity for People Who Aren't Christians, was actually kind of a thing where I said, I'm bringing along a partner for this. It was a book written for non-Christians, but, on various things. And his name is C.S. Lewis. And I'd gotten permission from the C.S. Lewis Foundation to use an awful lot. It'd be audacious to say that it was an update of Mere Christianity, but that was kind of the intent at the time. Mm-hmm. So deep love and affection for all of his writings. Part of my attraction, if you just look at his life and just the things about him, C.S. Lewis, which people always know, what does C.S. Lewis stand for? C.S. stands for Clive Staples, but he hated his name. So he always went by C.S., and his friends actually called him Jack, and he would go by Jack. He went to University College at Oxford, where he got double firsts in both classics and English. And he taught first at Magdalen. It's pronounced, it's written like Magdalene, like Mary Magdalene, but you pronounce it Magdalen. And so he taught at Magdalen College and then later at Cambridge. And in 1931, he came out as a Christian, and he came out of atheism. And that was aided by a conversation he had with J.R.R. Tolkien and a long friendship he had with Tolkien, who's a devout Christian, which we can talk about. Greatest Christian apologist of the modern era, hands down. He died on November 12th, 1963, the same day as John F. Kennedy and Aldous Huxley. And in one of my books, I wrote that of those three incredible lives, arguably Lewis impacted the most people. And he was part of a group called the Inklings, which is another part that's fascinating. There's a group of literary writers who got together at the Eagle and Child pub there in Oxford, which is locally known as the Bird and the Baby. And they would drink and read their writings and talk about their writings. And it had people like Lewis and Charles Williams and Tolkien and later Dorothy Sayers, and just an amazing literary group. And one quip, there was one when Lewis was Irish. He was born in Belfast, and he was at a big personality, and he would tease. And one day Tolkien came and they would read each writings, and Tolkien started reading one of his writings again. And Lewis stopped in the beginning. He says, "No, just tell me it's not another bloody elf story."
I love those elf
and
stories.
So they were good friends. And my attraction is multifaceted to him and his life and his writings.
Mm. Well, when did you first get introduced to him, though? Because I know that you became a Christian a little bit later on in life. So was it before you became a Christian?
I was reading him as a boy. I actually was reading him as a boy. I stumbled on his stuff. And I remember I read Mere Christianity in elementary school.
Yeah, but you have read very widely. So what was it about Lewis that drew you to him more than some of the other people that you've read?
Because and we can talk more about this. He wrote less as an academic and more as a scholar, and much of it is his apologetic appeal. He was earthy, he was funny, he was witty, could make very complicated things simple, and yet still stay deep. He wrote in so many different genres, whether it was fantasy or apologetics or even science fiction before science fiction was very well known at all. Some say he wrote some of the earliest science fiction. And so I was just drawn to the personality that came through the pages and what he wrote and how he wrote it. I just found it brilliant.
You mentioned just a bit about his journey to faith, and I only know a teeny bit about that, but I know that there's a lot more to it. And so is there more to his conversion story that you feel like would be really helpful for us to know?
Yeah, if you want to read his spiritual autobiography, it's called Surprised by Joy, and it's a fascinating read. But when it happened, okay, there is a story there. It was in September of 1931. And he had two friends over to where his rooms were at Magdalen at Oxford. It's called the New Building. And it's funny, at Oxford, it's called the New Building, but it was built in 1733, which tells you something about what it's like around Oxford. But so he had rooms there, and he had two friends over, Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien. And they would often, and they went for a long walk around what's called Addison's Walk, which is behind Magdalen College. It's a beautiful little walk. I've walked it, I feel like 1,000 times. And they were in a conversation about metaphor and myth. And Lewis loved the myths, the great Norse mythologies and such. And of course, if you've read Lord of the Rings and you know how much Lewis was also into, Tolkien was also into that. And so they were talking about those and as myths but yet all lies, but myths,
Sure.
And Tolkien said, "Oh, they're not all lies. Not all lies." And Lewis said he remembered that when Tolkien said that, there was this rush of wind and this swirl of leaves surrounding them. It was like this strangely spiritual, supernatural moment, because when Tolkien said that, it just penetrated Lewis. And then that wind leaf phenomenon kind of happened. And Tolkien said, yeah, with when it comes to myth, with Christianity, the myth is true. The great dying God story come to life. It's true. And maybe all the other myths are just shards of lights from the one true myth that's not a myth, but myth in the capital M sense of the word saga, but it's true.
Yeah.
And 12 days later, in a letter to Arthur Greaves, a boyhood friend, Lewis said that he had passed on to Christianity, moved from atheism to Christianity. And he mentioned, my talk with Tolkien that night was key.
Oh, I love that. Something else that you mentioned about Lewis, that I really appreciate, is that he is so much more than just one thing. He's more than an author. He's more than an apologist. He's more than, he was also a professor. And he writes as a husband in one of his books, and also a friend. And then obviously the Chronicles of Narnia were for children. But what I think in terms of our larger conversation, in terms of a Christian worldview, and what this podcast is really trying to highlight, is that he just really exemplified having a consistent Christian worldview in so many aspects of his life. How do you most see that?
He called himself the world's most reluctant convert.
Interesting.
But those that knew him, such as his biographer Walter Hooper, once called him the most converted man he ever met. And I would say that's true. All of Lewis's mind was wonderfully baptized by the Christian faith, just so thoroughly converted, we often think of conversion in almost pietistic ways, and what does it mean to walk with Christ that way? And Lewis was earthy. He was just earthy. It's often been said that he couldn't be hired today by the Evangelical College that stewards his personal letters. He was a pipe smoking, ale drinking, free speaking Irish guy. There are tales from my time at Oxford where the Inklings, many times when they met, they would meet, drink beer, and they would meet in the morning. Oh, this would start, and there were people that I've talked to at Oxford who said that Lewis would often come to class, and you could he'd been drinking beer, you smell the alcohol in his breath, and that his jacket would often have holes in the pockets because he'd take his pipe and put it in there, and ashes were still alive, and get out and have the holes in his pocket, and so it's funny how we focus on those kinds of things and miss maybe the larger picture of what it really means to be converted and to live a life deeply in Christ and walking with him and the fruits of the Spirit and such. Interesting little side story. I was in the Eagle and Child one day, and I was doing some afternoon writing in there, and I'd been there so many times. I'd built a relationship during that season with the manager and the staff. And I remember he just came over to me one day and he says, "Those bloody Christians." I said, "What? What did we do?" But he was talking about others. And he said, they keep nicking the menus. Now, nicking means stealing.
Oh, yeah.
They keep nicking the menus, stealing the menus. And he says, they cost me £2 each. And he says, they just come in here for Lewis and they steal my menus. And they're supposed to be Christians, right? They're coming in for Lewis and they steal the menus. And I remember thinking to myself, so many of those people wouldn't dare drink a pint. And they don't. They don't go in there. They don't spend a dime. But they'll steal.
Sure.
But they'll steal.
I really like what you said about, he was, that quote that you used, that he was deeply converted, and yet this very earthy image that you painted for us, because I feel like what a refreshing and maybe needed picture for especially like a non-Christian world to think about of a Christian, rather than like a, super pious, judgmental kind of hypocritical sense. I feel like that's what a wonderful, refreshing image to have in mind.
One of the reasons people like Lewis so much comes through in his writings.
Yeah, well, that's what I was
Same with G.K. Chesterton, very similar kind of personality. Yeah.
Well, that's where I think this might be connected then to my next question, because I wanted to hone in on a bit with him being an apologist. Am I saying this right? Apologist, right. One of the books that he's most well known for is Mere Christianity, in which I think you'll probably talk about this, but a lot of people don't realize that it was based on a series of radio talks that he had given, which were then put into this book. But he's obviously not the first apologist. He's not the last. And so, but his legacy there is outstanding. And so what do you think it was about him and the way that he wrote or the way that he communicated that has made him such a fruitful apologist?
Well, you're right about the radio addresses, and that even is a good entryway into how it was so popular. It started off with the BBC wanting him to do one 15-minute address. This was during World War II, doing one 15-minute radio address on the Christian faith. And it was so well received, they invited him to do a second address, and it ended up being 4 15-minute talks. And that was so successful, they said, well, would you come back and do an extra one to just answer questions? And he did. And then that was so received well, he did they asked him to do a second round of talks, and then he came back and do a third round of talks. So all of that then later was put together and into book form and polished up, obviously, from the radio side, and became Mere Christianity. So it's a series of about 12 to 13 different BBC addresses, a round of 4, and then another round of 4, and then another round of 4. His whole thing, when you read him and his letters and his writings and such, he wanted to translate the Christian faith into language anyone could understand. That was his passion, to translate the Christian faith in a way that anybody could understand. And part of his brilliance was that he was teased by his colleagues at Magdalen and later Cambridge. They called him Plain Jack. Like you're a gifted academician, but you're talking to plain people like you'd meet at the subway. And they meant it as kind of an insult, and he wore it as a badge of pride. And where he could take complicated things and make them simple and understandable. And he also understood process. I talk a lot about process and event when it comes to evangelism, when I'm teaching on those various things. He understood process, that you had to do that with people. There was a very obscure essay that he wrote that we can also put in the show notes, because otherwise people wouldn't know how to find this, but it was one of his more obscure essays. And he, in that essay, noted that the gospel went first to Jews, Judaizing Gentiles, and pagans. That when it first broke out, it went to those 3 groups of people. And he made an interesting observation. He said all 3 of those groups believed in the supernatural. They were conscious of a sin and judgment. They had a sense of personal purification and release, and they felt like the world had once been better than it now was. And he said, now nobody believes that. Nobody believes those 4 things. And then he said, I sometimes feel like we have to convert people to real paganism before we can convert them to Christianity. He understood that kind of process and event, and to even get them to embrace aspects of even those four kinds of things, the supernatural and conscious of sin and all this kind of stuff. So he understood that, and it came through in his writings and his apologetic arguments and his approach to apologetics.
Well, that goes back to something I mentioned at the top of the podcast, which is that you still hear people, talking about him, quoting him in such a different world than he lived in. And yet I think that speaks volumes to not only his pulse on culture, but I would argue just the prophetic nature of his writing. There's a lot of it. The more that I've read it, I'm like, wow, like the what you could predict about where the world was heading is so wise. And so I'm wondering, is that a calling, do you think? Like how do you think he developed that foresight?
Yeah, let me answer that in a couple of ways. First, let me say I agree with you, and then let me say I disagree. And because you can love Lewis and not canonize him. What made him so good and so prescient in many areas was the intellectual questions that plagued him throughout his spiritual journey. Things like, why does God allow pain and suffering, or how Christianity can be the only way to God, or the existence of miracles, were the very things that plagued so many other people. And it's what he devoted his life to helping people to understand and to get, answers to. And so that's timeless. And that's why reading him is so helpful even to this day. And he was a translator. And that was extremely helpful. One time he said something to the effect of, people praise me as a translator, but what I want to be is the founder of a school of translation, because anybody can do this who'll set their mind to it. And he did set his mind to it. He was a translator, student of culture, student of scripture and the Christian faith. And so his whole goal was, how can I translate this to a culture so that it gets it and understand it and can assess it? And there's a timelessness to that. When anyone does that, I don't care what era. There are some writings of Lewis that fare better than others in terms of time. I'm, a fan of the Screwtape Letters, but oh my goodness, is it penetrated left and right with World War II, asides.
Sure.
And it's that can make it not difficult reading, but you have to realize he was writing with the bombs dropping around him.
Yeah.
And he was writing to people who were engulfed in world conflict. Mere Christianity, I think, is timeless, but there are parts of it that aren't. And, you have to understand that most of his writings were written in 1940s and 1950s and 1930s. And so some of that comes through even in the language that's used. So that one of the reasons why we did Christianity for people who weren't Christians was because we were finding that people who were reading Mere Christianity, sometimes there was a kind of a beginning of a growing disconnect, but not so much. I mean, it's so timeless, but Christians don't have the barriers that non-Christians have to assessing Lewis. It's interesting. So we Christians read Lewis through a Christian lens. When a non-Christian reads him, we often want to say, "Oh, read Mere Christianity," and someone in 2022 or 23 reads it and says, "Well, this is good. This is interesting. This is helpful, but a lot of this isn't scratching where I'm itching. I have different questions." And so that's one where his apologetics may not serve the current moment, because there were certain things that Lewis didn't even know was going to be coming down the pike that people are asking. Many of our questions, even about sexuality, would never have really entered his mind to be worthy of a large essay.
That's a fair assessment. I appreciate that. I know that I'm not in the minority when I say that my first introduction to C.S. Lewis was The Chronicles of Narnia. As a little girl, I remember reading that, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in particular. And I know that's a lot of people's kind of first experience with C.S. Lewis. But I'm interested in that because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in particular is such as a Christian, I would say like a blatant presentation of the gospel. I don't know maybe if it's quite as blatant to a non-Christian, but for me, it is very much so. And I'm just thinking, like, in our present day culture, which is becoming increasingly hostile towards Christianity, why do you think that book is still so received so openly in our kind of more postmodern society?
Because they don't read it through your eyes. They don't read it as a Christian.
Okay.
And it's indirect. It's indirect. And when something's indirect, it's more easily received as opposed to something direct. And so, and it's arts and it's fantasy, and arts have a tendency to sneak through the defenses of the heart. And so that's why it was so powerful and effective. And I mean, Lord of the Rings was blatantly Christian and dripping with it. And Tolkien was a very profound, serious man about his faith. But the genre itself, allegory, which is what it was, allows us. And by the way, it's interesting another thing about Lewis and Tolkien. Tolkien hated allegory. Tolkien did not like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He felt like Lewis wrote it too quickly. He felt like it was too superficial. And this was a guy, of course, who would give you an entire appendix on how the Elvish grammar worked. So you would think that, and of course, Lewis, both of them were successful though in that area, just two different types. So Tolkien did not like allegory, did not like that series. And but the genre allows us to be the interpreter. Or better, it comes at us without aggression. And so we react without defensiveness. But yeah, the typical person who reads it, when they don't have a Christian worldview, they don't even have the basic contours of the gospel. They're not going to see Aslan as Jesus. They're not going to see the witch as Satan. They're not going to see Aslan coming off of the stone table as the resurrection of Jesus. They're not going to see all that because they don't have that story in their head.
Yes. And I wonder if there's just something so strategic about that, even for adults, to hear a presentation of the gospel without all of the religious baggage that you might have, and hearing it kind of stripped down in a...
Well, yeah, and I think that's the brilliance of that, because it's like imagine you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a non-Christian, and you love it. You're captivated by the story. You're moved by the sacrifice of Aslan and what he did. And the forgiveness to all of them, and just you're just taken with it. And then someone tells you at the end, that's the Jesus story.
Yeah.
Aslan was Jesus. And then the person goes, oh, it's like your eyes are open and you're touched by that story and the power of the gospel in a way that you wouldn't have been otherwise.
I love that. Now, you mentioned, we've talked about already, that C.S. Lewis wrote in a lot of different genres, which isn't normal. I mean, that's not typical of an author. And I'm going to put you on the spot
Which
here.
tells you something of his skill set. It's amazing that he could do it all.
Certainly. I'm going to put you on the spot, and because I'm interested. I know everybody wants to know, like, do you have a favorite? Or maybe you could choose a couple of favorites, but either maybe favorite genre or favorite book or two, or essay, or anything that he's written.
Because I'm as fascinated by the man as I am his writings, his autobiographical works have always been meaningful to me. Surprised by Joy, I mentioned, but also A Grief Observed, where he wrote about the death of his wife, and just very poignant. I'll always love Screwtape Letters, he was once asked, how do you write so effectively about temptation? And he said, because I am so tempted. I'm writing about myself. So I guess in many ways, Screwtape Letters is almost another autobiographical work.
Interesting.
I love Mere Christianity. I think that is a classic. I think that's just a book everybody ought to read. You and I have had offline conversations about how we both really like the science fiction trilogy, and that is not as popular or as well known as for other people, like Perelandra, The Hidden Planet, and such. But I don't think I've read anything of Lewis I didn't like and didn't gain something from. And even working through I got massive volumes of his personal correspondence, which I find fascinating.
Well, I guess on that note, I mean, it's obvious to anybody listening to this podcast that you know a lot about him, that he has influenced you. And I know also from reading your book, The Traveler's Guide to the Kingdom, which I really enjoy, just that you have, been to a lot of places where he has been. Like, your life has intersected his in a lot of different ways. I'm interested then, like, because you know more about him than just the average person who would just read his story. So what, from your experience in your interaction with his life, has been really meaningful to you?
I'm glad you mentioned that book. I don't want to push my own stuff, but that book is very special to me. And maybe we can link how you can get a copy of it as an ebook on the show notes. But it was kind of my spiritual mentoring book, where I imagined if I had someone that I could pour into, how would I like to do it? What would be a way of doing it? And I would take them to places, and I would take them to very special places. And I have each chapter is a different place that I would take them, from the Billy Graham Library in Charlotte to Wittenberg to Iona. And then, of course, one of the places was the Eagle and Child Pub, and on bringing up all things Lewis, and had more fun writing that chapter than I can begin to tell you. The thing about Lewis is that he wasn't interested in staking out narrow theological territory. He really was writing mere Christianity. And he got that phrase from Richard Baxter earlier, who said, who wanted to be merely Christian, not Catholic or Protestant, just mere Christian. And Lewis seized on that. And he didn't want to stake out, as I mentioned, this narrow theological ground, but mere Christianity, the essence of it, what we can all, embrace. And so as a result, he was more scholarship than academic. He was translator of things. And he took this amazing intellect and used it to popularize things. And I think that was special. If you've been in academia at all, which I have, you find that you can get seduced to bow down before the altar of the academy, and you're simply writing work for other academicians, and you really lose the sense of making a wider difference or communicating things on a popular level when you could. And Lewis was brilliant. I mean, his first work was still considered one of the best academic treatises written on that subject. But he turned his back on it, if you will, in order to be a translator and a popularizer. And I think that was something that is part of his life and story that I really gleaned from.
Well, as a final question then for this episode, if somebody has not read anything from Lewis, or it's been a while, what would you recommend that they start with? And I'm going to add something to this. Is there something that you would recommend, maybe now that they're a Christian, that they go back and reread from a different lens, perhaps? And then, okay, I'm going to add one more here too. While we're throwing out book suggestions. And then there are a lot of biographies that are written about him. You mentioned his autobiography, but is there a particular biography that you would recommend?
Yeah, I do have a couple of favorites on that. Yeah. Okay. In terms of where to begin, if you've never read him, I still would probably say Mere Christianity.
Okay. If
you are now a Christian and you want to go back and reread something, and that there's I would still say Screwtape Letters.
Okay.
And there's also a wonderful essay, Men Without Chests. That's a fascinating essay. And then there's the biographies. Alan Jacobs wrote one called The Narnian, and I think it may be the best one. The Narnian, based on Narnia, but The Narnian.
Okay. Yeah.
Alan Jacobs. Humphrey Carpenter wrote the definitive work on the Inklings as a whole, which includes Lewis, but all includes just the Inklings as a group. And that would be a great one to read, along with the two autobiographies that I mentioned, Surprised by Joy and A Grief Observed.
Awesome. Gosh, this has been a really fun and very easy podcast. And I'm sure we've always scratched the surface and all of the things that we could talk about with C.S. Lewis. But I think this is enough to, at least for me, encourage me to, one, keep reading him, but then also to read him through the lens of someone who wants to be a student of culture, and how to, when somebody did do what Lewis did so well, with some of the postures and humility that you mentioned about his life. I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jim. And thank you guys for listening. And we hope you'll tune back in next week. Thank you for listening to this week's installment of the Church and Culture Podcast with Dr. James White. We hope it was not only informative, but challenging and the start to an ongoing conversation. To stay up to date with all the latest, check out the daily headline news and subscribe to the Church and Culture blog, all found at churchandculture.org. You can even keep up with Jim by following him on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at James Emery White. We hope you'll join us next week. Goodbye for now.